Sup, my chooms and hair loss witchers. Hope y'all had a preem 4th of July earlier this week. You've gotta love the 4th of July. Not only is it an occasion to celebrate the birth of our glorious nation, but there is something liberating about the notion of gaining independence in general, whether it be independence from taxation without representation, or independence from the cruel fate nature has bestowed upon us. After all, we are not living in the Dark Ages anymore. Hair loss is treatable, and the closest thing we have to a cure is to start treatment before we lose too much ground to begin with, and fortunately, we have two fantastic weapons in this battle that both have tremendous efficacy and value, especially when they are used together. I'm of course talking about Finasteride and topical minoxidil. This stack is considered the gold standard for treating hair loss, and for good reason. It works extremely well at stopping the progression of androgenic alopecia, and many people will even regrow some hair. On top of this, they're both FDA-approved medications that are clinically proven to be safe and effective with an extremely low incidence of side effects that can be mitigated through titration adjustments in the rare circumstances when side effects do occur, such as using 1 milligram every other day or 0.5 milligrams every other day. It's always going to be effective, and what the appropriate dose is going to be for you is going to be based on what your doctor determines is appropriate for you. So, of course, as amazing as these two FDA-approved drugs are, they're not perfect. No medication is going to be 100% efficacious. When it comes to Finasteride, most people, even detractors of the drug, will admit that it still works well. Most of the controversy behind Finasteride stems from people gaslighting about the drug by baselessly accusing it of causing every adverse side effect imaginable, even going so far as to claim Finasteride can change one's sexual orientation or gender identity. There's of course zero scientific evidence to support these claims, but since Finasteride's detractors are so bombastic in their views, this has created a culture of fear, which leads many people to imagine all these horrible things about Finasteride, when in reality they're just giving themselves a nocebo effect. So, as great as Finasteride is, it works even better when combined with minoxidil. We know Finasteride works by suppressing the 5A reductase enzyme, which stops the conversion of the alpha chad hormone testosterone into the beta bitch trash hormone DHT, dihydrotestosterone, which of course is the androgen which is responsible for destroying our precious hair follicles and turning us into ugly slapheads. Minoxidil, on the other hand, works by mechanisms which aren't fully understood, and even though there are several theories, we know it can't work through any kind of hormonal mechanism like Finasteride, because minoxidil has been shown to grow hair anywhere on the body it is applied, including body and facial hair, where androgens are actually beneficial for hair growth in those regions. So, since Finasteride and minoxidil work by different mechanisms but have the same end result, this means the two drugs can be combined to produce a synergistic effect which will effectively treat hair loss in nearly everybody who uses them. However, topical minoxidil is not without its drawbacks. For one, the topical solution is available in different forms. There is the liquid solution and a foam solution, and neither one is perfect. The liquid, while it can be applied easily to the scalp with the included 1 milliliter dropper, tends to give the hair a greasy look, and it can take a long time to dry, sometimes as long as 4 hours even. The foam, on the other hand, does dry quickly, about 30 minutes or so, but sadly, since the foam expands a lot, it tends to get wasted on the hair before it touches the scalp. So you can get around this flaw, fortunately, by turning the foam into a liquid and then applying it like you would liquid minoxidil, only it won't be as greasy and it will dry much faster, usually just 30 minutes or so. And I have a tutorial on how to do this, and I'll go ahead and link that video below if you're interested in learning how to turn foam minoxidil into liquid minoxidil. But another issue with topical minoxidil is many people are convinced it just doesn't work that well, and in some instances they are right. In order for minoxidil to work, it has to go through an enzymatic step involving the sulfotransferase enzyme, which is an enzyme located on our scalp which turns minoxidil into its active form, minoxidil sulfate. Even though there are some tests in development, there is currently no practical way to test for the sulfotransferase enzyme, so as of today, the only real way to find out if minoxidil works effectively is through trial and error, which is unfortunate since oftentimes we need to give it at least 6 months or even up as long as a year to find out how effective a hair loss treatment is, since the growth cycle of our hair follicles takes 6 months. So, even though minoxidil works extremely well for the majority of people, many people think the drug will not be very effective because of this necessary enzymatic step, and have looked into alternative means of using minoxidil, including taking the drug orally. Now, It's likely that oral minoxidil, when taken in very high doses, like 5 milligrams per day or greater, will produce better results than topical minoxidil. The major issue with that, though, are the life-threatening cardiovascular side effects that earned oral minoxidil the dubious honor of a black box warning on its package insert. So, what people are doing that makes them think they can kind of get around this is to take a very low dose of oral minoxidil with the hopes of minimizing side effects while also getting maximum benefits beyond what a simple topical solution of minoxidil could provide. Now, I have already discussed very much in depth about why I don't think oral minoxidil, even when taken at low doses, is safe, and I'll link the video where I discuss this subject down below, so I'm not going to revisit that subject. Rather, today, what I want to do is I just want to find out if oral minoxidil, when taken at lower doses, really is any better than topical minoxidil, and if there's any point in switching from topical minoxidil to oral minoxidil from strictly an efficacy point of view, while ignoring any potential safety issues for the moment. So there has been a tremendous amount of hype behind oral minoxidil lately, and since many doctors will not prescribe oral minoxidil for any reason, many people have decided to turn themselves into human guinea pigs and buy the drug online without a prescription through shady gray market pharmacies. So with all the hype about low-dose oral minoxidil being so much better than topical minoxidil, certainly there have to be a number of studies showing it has superior efficacy than topical minoxidil, right? I mean, surely people would prefer to take a last-ditch blood pressure medication with a black box warning that has potentially fatal side effects over an over-the-counter topical drug that has minimal systemic absorption only if it was a lot more effective in its oral form, right? Surely there's a lot of research showing how much more effective oral minoxidil is to topical minoxidil, making the risk of oral minoxidil worthwhile, right? Well, as it turns out, despite the nauseating level of fanfare behind oral minoxidil, there is only just one small study published in 2020 comparing the two for androgenetic alopecia, and it was published just as a letter to the editor, meaning it didn't have any peer review, and it only looked at women with androgenetic alopecia, also known as female pattern baldness, and as we are about to see, the results were pretty underwhelming. So this was a 24-week randomized non-blinded study of 1 milligram of oral minoxidil versus 5% topical minoxidil once daily. Like I said, this was only in women aged 18 to 65 years of age with female pattern hair loss, with Ludwig stages from 2 to 4, which is the female equivalent of the Norwood scale, which is a metric to measure the progression of hair loss. The primary endpoint of the study was to look for a change in hair density along the sides of the head using trichoscopes, as well as looking at overall photos of the hair and using questionnaires to assess quality of life. The trichoscope is the only tool that can measure exact hair counts, so that probably will serve as a better measurement of progress rather than a questionnaire or photo, which could be subject to bias or could be affected by factors like lighting, hairstyling, and angling. So in this study, there were only 52 participants originally, and 50 ended up completing the study, and half of the subjects were on oral minoxidil at 1 milligram daily, and the other half used 5% topical minoxidil. So looking at the results, at first glance, it does look like the subjects on oral minoxidil did a bit better, with a 12% increase in hair density versus a 7.2% increase in hair density with the topical minoxidil group. However, this was not a statistically significant difference, and so you can't conclude from these numbers that oral minoxidil is better than topical minoxidil. This may seem counterintuitive because, after all, it does look like 12% is a better number than 7.2%, but when you are dealing with such a small number of subjects and a small difference in outcomes, a difference like this can be due to just chance alone, which is why researchers do statistical analyses to validate their results. Here's an analogy to better explain this. Suppose you toss a coin 10 times, and 6 times you get heads, and 4 times you get tails. That's 60% heads. Can you conclude from this that this coin must somehow be weighted so that you are more likely to get heads than tails? Of course not. The result was probably just by chance, and the next time you toss the coin 10 times, you might only get 4 heads and 6 tails. Now, imagine you toss the coin 1,000 times. Suppose you get 600 heads and 400 tails. That's still 60% heads, but getting getting a difference like that with such a large number of coin tosses makes you pretty damn sure that this couldn't arise from just chance. And you'd be right to conclude that the odds of getting heads or tails is not 50% with this particular coin. The coin must be a trick coin that is weighted to make it more likely to get heads than tails. You might come to the same conclusion even using few coin flips if the result of the coin flips was even more unexpected. Even with 10 tosses, you would be very suspicious that something was wrong with the coin if all 10 flips turned out to be heads. So, in scientific research, when comparing two groups, the assumption is that the results in both groups will be the same. But if you see a small difference in outcomes in a very large number of subjects, or a very large difference in outcomes in a small number of subjects, those differences probably aren't due to chance, but are due to real effects of the drugs you are studying. On the other hand, a small difference in a small number of subjects is probably due to chance, just like tossing 10 coins and having 6 of them come up heads is just due to chance. So, the bottom line in this study is that there was no statistically significant difference between the efficacy of low-dose oral minoxidil versus topical minoxidil at 5%. You can see the rest of the results of the study in this table here. As for adverse effects, it was found that itchy scalp occurred in 19% of the topical minoxidil group versus none, as you might expect, in the oral minoxidil group. However, in the case of oral minoxidil, swelling of the legs occurred in 4% of the subjects, and none of the subjects got swelling of the legs in the topical group. Hypertrichosis, which is unwanted hair growth, was seen in 27% of the oral versus 4% of the topical group, which makes sense since an oral drug has more systemic absorption than a topical drug. Of course, unwanted hair might be more of a problem in women than it is in men, which is why they probably reported on this, but some of the women may have just ignored the excess body hair growth, and the women who complained ended up just waxing off the excess hair. In the oral minoxidil group, the blood pressure didn't change, but the heart rate increased by 6.5% on the average. So even at this apparently tiny dose of oral minoxidil, you're having a negative effect on the cardiovascular system. Remember, cardiovascular disease is the biggest cause of death in the human species. Not even the number of people killed by COVID comes close to the number of people who die of heart disease every single year. So you might ask, what's the big deal? So what if the pulse goes up a little bit with oral minoxidil? Well, we all know that exercise is good for people. We know it prolongs life, and also that people who are in good shape have a lower resting heart rate than people who are sedentary, for instance. What you may not have heard, though, is that increasing the heart rate, even by just a little bit, is strongly associated with an increase in the risk of dying. I'll link an article below, which is a meta-analysis of 46 studies, including over 1.2 million healthy subjects that looked at resting heart rate and mortality rates. But the bottom line is that with every 10 beats per minute increased in resting heart rate, the mortality rate increased by 9%. So a drug that increases your heart rate is not a benign drug, no matter how healthy you think you are. It's not like heart disease is some rare, obscure condition. Most of us alive today will die from heart disease. Is that a risk worth taking for an oral variation of a drug that doesn't even have any evidence of being objectively superior to the topical FDA-approved variant just because you saw someone on YouTube who claims it's okay? So, summarizing the findings in the study, first, there was no statistical improvement in hair growth from using low-dose oral minoxidil over topical minoxidil. Secondly, it is important to note that the adverse effects of oral minoxidil were systemic, namely it was edema and increased heart rate, while the adverse effects of the topical minoxidil were just local and included trivial things like scalp itchiness. They did note that there was less shedding with oral minoxidil than topical minoxidil, but that is not necessarily a good thing. Applying water to your scalp will cause less initial shedding than minoxidil, but that's because minoxidil works, and any hair loss treatment which works will cause shedding due to the hair follicles entering prematurely into the anagen growth phase, which requires that the old telogen resting phase hairs fall out. I have a video about shedding, which I'll link below, but people freak out way too much about the shed these drugs cause. If you're so scared of the shed, what do you think is going to happen if you don't go on treatment? Your hair is sure as hell still going to shed, but it's never coming back unless you suck it up, get on treatment, and accept the fact that you may have to deal with a shed or two. You need to get rid of the old bad hair to replace it it with the new good hair. So less shedding is not necessarily a good sign that oral minoxidil is working. It's possible the opposite is even true. So I know people could argue that this study is limited since they only use 1 milligram per day of oral minoxidil. So what about 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams per day? Well, we've already established that due to the dramatically higher incidence of systemic side effects from even just 1 milligram of oral minoxidil, then it is clear that if you go even higher than that, you are getting into doses that can lower the blood pressure. And if people are already having systemic effects with even just 1 milligram per day, how much worse would the edema be or increased heart rate be on higher doses, especially long term? And what about the risk of more serious heart problems that have been seen with higher dose oral minoxidil? Is it possible the higher dose would work better? I mean, sure. After all, 5% topical minoxidil works about 40% better than 2% topical minoxidil. But the whole purpose behind lower dose oral minoxidil is for people to take a more effective version of minoxidil that has a better safety profile, and so far there is zero evidence that 1 milligram of oral minoxidil is either more safe or more effective than just regular 5% topical minoxidil you can buy anywhere these days. So in addition to that, we also know minoxidil has diminishing returns. That is why 5% minoxidil doesn't work 250% better than 2% minoxidil. So it's possible that by upping the dose of oral minoxidil, all you're doing is just increasing your risk of life-threatening side effects with minimal increases in benefits towards the hair. So to summarize all of this, we don't have any data which suggests that low-dose oral minoxidil is superior to topical minoxidil in treating androgenetic alopecia, but we do have evidence that oral minoxidil, even when it's taken at really small doses, still has far more systemic side effects than topical minoxidil. Now, I know people are going to be upset hearing this because, they really want to normalize the use of oral minoxidil as a hair loss treatment, but the fact of the matter is that oral minoxidil has been around for a while, and there is a good reason why the manufacturers of the drug, Upjohn Pharmaceuticals, decided to formulate it as a topical rather than just seeking FDA approval for Lonatin, which is the trade name for oral minoxidil that is almost never prescribed for anything, even blood pressure, as there are much safer alternatives on the market today, such as ACE inhibitors and beta blockers. So yeah, I know there are going to be people out there who say things like they've used oral minoxidil and they've gotten great results, and that's all fine and dandy, but heartwarming stories and anecdotes like that really mean fuck all compared to concrete scientific research, which up to this point hasn't shown that low-dose oral minoxidil is in any way superior to topical minoxidil. So what about the people who are non-responders to topical minoxidil? Maybe they'll watch this video and decide that even if it doesn't work better or if it's more dangerous, they'll go ahead and use it anyway, because even after 6 months to a year of treatment on topical minoxidil, they found that it has been ineffective for them. Well, first of all, many people tend to assume a drug isn't working when they don't get regrowth, which is a mistake, because oftentimes the best thing a pharmaceutical can do for us is to halt further progression of male pattern baldness, not necessarily give us regrowth. So don't assume you are a non-responder just because the drug doesn't work as well as you were hoping it would. Slowing down or stopping further progression of hair loss is often the best thing we can hope for. Also, make sure you are using finasteride with minoxidil, as while minoxidil is great at promoting hair growth, it doesn't address the underlying cause of androgenetic alopecia, which is the presence of the trash hormone DHT on the scalp. Using minoxidil without a 5A reductase inhibitor or some kind of direct androgen antagonist like Fluridil will only buy you some time. It will not solve the problem long term. Secondly, if you are a non-responder to topical minoxidil due to low levels of the sulfotransferase enzyme in the hair follicles, understand that the sulfotransferase enzyme levels in the liver can also vary between individuals. So you shouldn't assume that oral minoxidil will somehow skip this enzymatic step. It can't. Minoxidil in its base form is completely worthless. It has to convert into minoxidil sulfate via the sulfotransferase enzyme, regardless of whether it is administered orally or if it's administered topically. So if you are a non-responder to topical minoxidil, meaning your hair loss has not stopped or at least slowed down upon starting treatment even after a year of use, then a much better solution than playing Russian roulette with a dangerous drug like oral minoxidil would be to increase the sulfotransferase enzyme on the scalp. Fortunately, there is a way to do this. It has been shown in a study from 2019 that 0.1% tretinoin increases sulfotransferase activity on the scalp and helps improve the efficacy of minoxidil in non-responders. Tretinoin is an anti-acne medication, but it is not a controlled substance, and it is pretty easy to get a prescription for, and dermatologists will sometimes even prescribe it off-label for the purpose of hair loss. Also, It's been shown that 10 and 15% minoxidil works well in people who don't respond to 5% minoxidil, but interestingly enough, it's been shown that 10 and 15% minoxidil are actually not as effective in people who are responders to 5% minoxidil. Additionally, 10 and 15% minoxidil is pretty obscure, and it's usually sold through shady-looking websites, so I wouldn't trust any 10 or 15% minoxidil brands unless they are compounded by a legitimate pharmacy. Also, a lot of people ask me about how they're supposed to mix tretinoin with minoxidil, and you don't really need to. Just apply the tretinoin to the area of the scalp you want to apply the minoxidil to, and give it about 10 minutes. It absorbs pretty quickly, and you only need a thin layer on the surface, usually a little more than just a bead or just a little dot of the cream or the gel. So since the research shows that oral minoxidil, even when it's taken at small doses, has more side effects and isn't any more effective, I really think it's best to just stick with topical minoxidil. It is safe and is the best hair growth stimulant we have on the market today, and just like Finasteride, the way you take it can be modified in case you are a non-responder or if you are sensitive to it, and that's something you could discuss with your doctor. You know, I'm not biased at all here, folks. I would love it if oral minoxidil were as good as people say it is, but so far the evidence in favor of it is limited to just anecdotes on social media and appeals to authorities, such as saying things like, "Oh, well, I know a doctor who disagrees," as if that means anything. You know, I know a lot of cardiologists too, and not one of them would recommend oral minoxidil under any circumstances. So clearly, appealing to authority doesn't belong in a serious discussion on this subject. What we need is actual scientific research that is reproducible and has a good study design using a randomized double-blinded trial. We don't need research looking at human tissue in a petri dish or fucking mouse studies anymore. This is people's cardiovascular health we are talking about after all. So if people want to keep on enthusiastically recommending that it's safe, then the burden of proof is still on them. It's not enough anymore for people to say things, "Oh, well, my doctor says it's safe." That doesn't matter. Lay down the evidence or get lost. And with that, I don't know about you guys, but I have heard that Cyberpunk 2077 just got a really huge update, so I've got some quality leisure time to get to. So until then, keep fighting the good fight and stay safe, chooms. Take care.